What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Fireside Giants. I'm your host, Anthony Rivardo, joined by my co-host, Alex Wilson. And Giants training camp starts in less than 1 month. The Giants announced the dates for their open practices for training camp today, actually. I think they're having 11 open practices. And again, starting in just under a month at July 24th. We're super excited. Hopefully, we can meet some of you guys at training camp. I'm going to try and go to at least one of the practices. Hopefully, Alex can join me and we can meet up with some of you guys. That would be really great. But in the meantime, we're going to keep previewing the upcoming training camp, talking about some of these players who might be battling for roster spots and potentially winning a spot or losing a spot on the roster through training camp practices. That's what we're going to dive into today's 3 players that we think might be on the bubble, even surprisingly so, as we head towards training camp just 1 month away. But before we dive into all that, make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed this episode. Subscribe to the channel if you're new. Ring the bell so don't miss the episode. Comment your thoughts down below in the comment section. If you're listening to Apple or Spotify, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review. Go ahead and follow us on all of our social media channels at Fireside Giants. And without further ado, Alex, how are you doing today, my friend? And I want to immediately dive into this first player to discuss who might be on the bubble for the roster this upcoming training camp period, and that is slot cornerback Darnay Holmes. I feel like he's been living on the bubble each of the last few seasons, but this year, it really feels like his job could be in danger. How are you feeling about Darnay Holmes going into training camp?
I'm doing pretty good, and listen, Darnay Holmes, he has been surviving these roster cuts year in and year out, despite the fact he's kind of underperformed. Great dude, good leader, and the Giants are actually thinking about pushing him to the outside. So you kind of look at where this team is going at cornerback. We discussed this in the most recent episode, with guys like Cordell Flott and Nick McLeod and Deontay Banks. We have this young, inexperienced secondary. And then you have Darnay Holmes, who's has the most experience of the bunch, but also isn't the best of the bunch. The interesting thing about Darnay is that he's actually really good around the line of scrimmage. He sniffs out screens, he sniffs out runs. He's pretty good in that regard. He's just not good in coverage. He just, something about playing in the slot has been really, really problematic for him. But that's the thing, though. He wasn't a slot cornerback at the collegiate level. He was a boundary cornerback. And I think it's finally time for the Giants to admit that they are not getting the best value out of Darnay Holmes, because maybe he just never was supposed to be in the nickel spot. Maybe he was supposed to be out wide this whole time. And look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you Darnay's going to be a good outside corner, because I certainly don't know, and I certainly am just looking at his past performance. But that's where his best seasons came from at the collegiate level. They changed his position. He had a nice build, good quickness for the slot position. It's never really caught on there. He did some good stuff in terms of stopping screens and whatnot, sniffing out, plays closer to the line of scrimmage. But Darnay, to make this team, has to become a solid boundary corner, in my opinion. I think his days in the slot are probably numbered. If they consider him just a slot corner, I don't think they need him. I think you'd probably just end up rolling with Trey Herndon in that respect, because he does have experience at both spots and has a lot more experience and better experience. But Darnay is one of those kind of glue guys who, if he was a really good football player, would be a very, very good asset to this defense entirely. But if he could show that he's got some gas left in the tank, especially on the boundary, and holds his own out there during training camp, makes some plays, shows that he's got some upside, he's going to make this team. But if he doesn't, and he struggles, and he continues to struggle in the slot, and he really gives up a lot of receptions, he probably, I'm not going to say probably, but I say there's a 50-50 shot he gets cut, especially if the Giants are sitting there with over $10 million in cap space, recognize they need some more veteran quality experience at cornerback, and they go out and sign somebody. So, looking at Darnay, do you think there's a world where he survives because he can offer some value on the boundary, or do you think those days have passed?
I don't think those days have passed, and I think that to tie it into the discussion about him potentially being a roster bubble player, the fact that the Giants are trying to give him an opportunity to play on the boundary kind of tells me that he is on the bubble, and he needs to prove his worth and prove that he can play more than one role for this team and prove his value to this team in order to make the roster. Yeah, we know what he provides at slot cornerback, and it's nothing too special. It's okay. He's a solid depth piece at the nickel. But if he can be a solid depth piece on the outside as well, or even a potential starter if they ever need him to be, that makes him tremendously more valuable, and that makes him pretty much a lock to make this roster over some of the other guys that he's competing against. So I think that Darnay Holmes, when you're looking at him, he played in his college career on the boundary, as you mentioned. That's really important to take note of. Maybe he is better suited for the outside. I know that when we've talked to Brian Walker, his defensive backs coach, before, he has said he should have been on the boundary. That's probably where he's better suited. That's what he did in college. Maybe he is right about that. Maybe Darnay Holmes steps up on the boundary through training camp and preseason and earns his spot on this roster. But there is a lot of competition, and we're even going to bring up another name as an outside cornerback in a little while here that we're discussing who could be battling for that roster spot and also could find himself on the outs if things don't go right for him. But I do want to switch sides here, Alex. Go over to the offensive side of the ball and look at this receiving core, which we've talked about almost endlessly this offseason. We have done plenty of discussions about Malik Neighbors, Jalen Hyatt, Wan'Dale Robinson, Darius Slayton, all these receivers that we're really high on and we think are going to turn this Giants offense into a much better unit this upcoming season. But how about one player that might just be battling for a roster spot, and surprisingly so? Allen Robinson, veteran wide receiver. We all know him, used to be a 1,000-yard receiver, was really good during his time with the Jacksonville Jaguars, but in recent years, well, he's not really the same player anymore. Knee injuries later, many, many years later. He's not the player that he once was, but the Giants do have this former Pro Bowl wideout stashed on their roster. But will he make a roster spot? Well, Alex, what do you think about that? Do you think Allen Robinson is fighting for a roster spot? Do you think he's comfortably on there as a backup and depth piece? Personally, I like him a lot as a depth player, veteran with a lot of experience, good player still. But how do you feel about it? Do you think that Allen Robinson has a chance at making this roster?
I absolutely do. Why, you might ask? Because the Giants are always bound for injury. Somebody's getting hurt at some point, and how many times have you seen this Giants team whittled to the bone, and have nobody, and they're just picking up guys off the street to play for them. Having a veteran, experienced guy like Allen Robinson, it's not only an important thing, it's an essential thing. I'd rather have him on the roster than a guy like Isaiah McKenzie. There's another slot option. You have guys who can return kicks, like, you got Tyrone Tracy now, and Gunnar Olszewski, of course. So, right now, in my opinion, Allen Robinson, cheap, veteran minimum dude with that much experience. He can offer some leadership in the locker room to some young guys like Malik Neighbors and Wan'Dale and Jalen Hyatt. I don't see why it's not a benefit to have him on this team. Now, if he's horrible and he can't run and he looks washed during training camp, yeah, you probably move on from him just because he's not going to be an asset for you. He's going to stink when he's on the field. But if he runs well, makes some nice catches, beats some of the cornerbacks up, shows that he can be a leader in that locker room for the youngsters, why wouldn't you keep him on the roster if there's a spot available? I think he could be an asset in that regard. And look, this team is very young. This offense, this receiver core specifically, aside from Darius Slayton, is very, very young. They need an experienced guy to be there to give some pointers, just be, a voice in the locker room, keep guys kind of head up, especially if they go through any struggles. Allen Robinson's been with teams that have been really good. He's been with teams that have been really bad. So he kind of has seen it all. I don't know much about him as a leader, but I think that he knows he's at the back end of his career. He's just trying to get a couple extra paydays. And I think that he can offer some value there as kind of a mentor for these youngsters. So I don't see why, if he has a little bit of gas left in the tank, they wouldn't give him a roster spot, given the fact that they do have one to actually offer him.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, he's competing with the likes of, I guess, Gunnar Olszewski, if the Giants still feel like he's maybe 50-50 in terms of being the return specialist. Now with the changed formatting of the kickoff rules, he could actually be fighting for a roster spot as well this season. And also competing with the likes of, I guess, Isaiah Hodgins, who maybe could be a sneaky surprise cut candidate once we get to camp if he doesn't stand out, and Isaiah McKenzie, who I don't think really has a strong chance of making this roster. He's probably this season's Cole Beasley. So Allen Robinson, considering the experience he has and the high level that he's played at before, I definitely feel as though he's got a really good chance of making this roster. But Alex, I know that we said we were going to do 3 players, and I do want to talk about this third player, Trey Hawkins, and why he could maybe be the surprise cut candidate. But I also just want to rattle off a few surprise candidates here as potential roster bubble players. I just mentioned another one, Isaiah Hodgins. I don't feel like his job is safe. I guess he's WR5 right now. But again, Allen Robinson competing with him and maybe a couple other players. Bryce Ford Wheaton could maybe steal a spot from him. Isaiah Hodgins, I think, is on the bubble, whether fans realize it or not. Another player, Lawrence Cager, think he might be on the bubble. And honestly, one of these interior offensive linemen that the Giants drafted a couple years ago could end up being on the outs. Josh Azidu has gotten chances to start, hasn't really been too impressive, and now they're trying him out at right tackle. could be an indication that he's fighting for a roster spot as a surprise player. And Marcus McKethan, we've barely seen him on the field. When we have, he hasn't been too great. Maybe he's on the bubble as well. So, and then again, I want to talk about Trey Hawkins. He started the season last year. In week 1, he was in the starting lineup, quickly taken out of the starting lineup, and now where's he going to place in here going into year 2 of his career? He's only a 6th-round pick, so if the Giants feel like they have better players on the roster, they can cut ties, and it's not really a big problem. But it would definitely be a move that upsets the fans because he really won over the fan base through training camp last year. How do you feel about Trey Hawkins and really any of these other potential surprise cut candidates that I mentioned, and maybe any others that you have in mind?
Yeah, I mean, look, when you're looking at Trey Hawkins, I think that he was always a developmental project. I think he really impressed during training camp last year, as you kind of referenced. The thorn in his side was the San Francisco game where he missed like 4 tackles, and the Giants did not let him sniff the field after that. There was a play I remember, I want to say it was McCaffrey going through a gap on the right side, and it was there for Hawkins to fill, and he bailed out of it, and he didn't touch the field again in that game. In fact, he didn't touch the field for like 3 games after that. So they saw that on film. They're like, dude, if you're going to want to be in the NFL, if you're going to want to be a good player, you can't bail out of gaps that are open that you have to fill. That's your job. That's what you're getting paid to do. If you want to make millions and, have a successful career, you got to put your head in there and get involved. Obviously, I do think that right now when you're looking at this Giants team, there are better options than Trey Hawkins. I think that he's a second-year player. I think that they're working on him as a project, and I think he's got a lot of tools. Really good athlete. You could say an elite athlete. I do think that he's got good size as well. In fact, I think he's really a quintessential frame to be a corner, an outside boundary corner. The problem is he's just so inexperienced. Like, you're talking about inexperience for like a guy coming from Kentucky, or inexperience from a guy coming from Maryland, like Banks, or Cordell Flott from LSU. Those guys are experienced. Trey Hawkins is a whole nother level of experience because he's coming from Old Dominion, right? So you're not just getting a player who is coming from a school and hasn't had that much NFL playing time. He's coming from a tiny school that barely ever has any players get drafted to begin with. And he's trying to fight for a roster spot. So, yeah, I think he makes the team, end all be all. I think that, he makes the team because he's got qualities they want to keep building on. But he's got to be aggressive. He's got to ball. You know what I mean? He has to showcase what he can do. And, I know he's been doing hard work this offseason. I'm sure of it. So, I'm excited to see where he kind of ends up in this training camp kind of position battle. Maybe he's kind of being slept on right now. There hasn't been much talk about him because so much investment's been going into Cordell Flott's development for an extra year. But let's not rule out Hawkins just yet. We haven't seen him just yet. The talk of the town is Flott because he's the natural guy to be progressed here. But Hawkins could be the sleeper, and we're talking him as a potential cut candidate, but I see him as more of a sleeper candidate on the secondary. So, if there's anybody else that kind of pops to mind, there's tons of like backup tight ends that probably don't make the roster. But I'm thinking of a player that like really is on the bubble right now. The linebackers, Darian Beavers is a guy that stands out. First and foremost, I think he probably gets cut after that ACL tear. Or was it Achilles? One of those two. I think it was ACL. He was on the practice squad last year, really didn't make much of an impact. I know he's like on the training camp roster right now, but I think he probably ends up in the practice squad again. Isaiah McKenzie, I don't think makes this roster because we have enough kick returners at this point in time. I know we probably want another slot option, but Malik Neighbors played a lot of slot in college too, so I think that they're going to move him around. Even Hyatt had a lot of slot, kind of usage at Tennessee. So I do think that this team has more than enough slot options. They could even put Theo Johnson as a jumbo there. So, plenty of creativity they can kind of deploy to compensate if Wan'Dale was to miss any time. But, I think there's a lot of guys competing for roster spots, but I think there's a lot of competition. And end of the day, I think you just go with the guys with more upside long term because this team is very young, and I think they want to keep it that way.
Yeah, the last player that I just want to get your take on, though, Alex, as a potential surprise cut candidate is Isaiah Hodgins. I feel like he is a sleeper because we were talking about Allen Robinson and his path to making the roster. I wonder if that comes at the expense of Isaiah Hodgins, who in 2022, we were talking about him potentially being a long-term starter on this team. Like, he looked so impressive during that run towards the back end of the season and into the postseason. Great game against the Vikings in the wild card round. And then last season, he made 8 starts, barely saw the field, didn't really make a massive impact. Again, the Giants' offense was broken, but even still, we would have liked to see more from Isaiah Hodgins. What are your thoughts on him as a potential surprise cut candidate as we get closer to training camp?
Yeah, and honestly, it may end up coming down to Isaiah Hodgins and Allen Robinson as the guys that are competing for that last remaining receiver spot. And Hodgins is chemistry with Daniel Jones, so I think they're going to keep him over Robinson personally, if that was kind of what they had to decide between. I think Hodgins is a fine player. He's a decent red zone threat. He can get open. He has really, really good hands. So I do think he's a fine player. He's a backup though. Like he's not a starting caliber player for me. He is a WR4. He's behind Slayton, he's behind High, he's behind Wandell, and he's behind Neighbors. So even WR5 if you want to go that far. So the problem with Hodge is he offers no value on special teams. So, he has to be productive. He has to be able to step in and contribute. And we've seen him do it in the past. The problem was they had so many different offensive line, kind of, I guess, combinations and quarterback turnover last year. Nobody could really succeed. The only guy that was succeeding was Wandale because they were just getting rid of the ball so fast. He was able to get the ball and operate in space, and occasionally you'd see one of those guys get a deep ball. But it was more so Wandale was the insurance outlet, and he was getting a lot of insurance. So I do think that he benefited the most from last year's situation. But Hodgins, with a little bit more time in the pocket, is a serviceable receiver, and I do think he has some value left to him, especially because he's much younger than Allen Robinson. So if it's between those two guys, I think I lean Hodgins.
I think that's totally fair. And again, I think this is something that gets battled out during training camp. Like, we're leaning Hodgins right now. Maybe Hodgins doesn't look so sharp all throughout camp, and Allen Robinson looks like he's coming to make that second break in his career and have a big bounce back season. Who knows? So it'll be really interesting. And of course, we're going to continue to preview all the different players and storylines heading up into training camp. Again, only 1 month away. And once it's here, stay tuned because we're going to have plenty of training camp coverage leading you on into the regular season right here on Fireside Giants. So make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed this episode. Subscribe to the channel if you're new. Ring the bell so don't miss the episode and comment your thoughts down below in the comment section. If you're listening to Apple or Spotify, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review. Go ahead and follow us on all of our social media channels at Fireside Giants. Without further ado, we'll catch you all on the next one. Have a good one, and let's go Giants.